All right, so not sure if any of you have heard of Jaden Ivey. Jaden Ivey is NBA basketball player, been in the headlines the past couple of days. He's from Indiana. He's also a Purdue guy. I used to preach 40 minutes from Purdue. Wasn't my favorite team in Indiana, but I kind of watched those guys. But he was just kicked off of the Bulls team, away from the Bulls team, because he made a couple of statements on Instagram Live. And one of the things that he said is they proclaim Pride Month in the NBA, and they say, come join us for Pride Month to celebrate unrighteousness. You agree with that statement? But he got waived by the Bulls for making that statement. And he was on for an hour. He said some other things after he got waived. He said the Bulls management can wave at him while they are on their way to burn in hell. Probably not the best thing to say if you want to be back in the NBA again. And he's also claimed Steph Curry is not a true Christian since he refuses to speak out on some of these issues. Now, what we're talking about today has some relevance to some of these comments. I would probably remind Jaden, if I had the chance to talk to him, I would love to have the chance to talk to him, that we need to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. We need to speak the truth in love. We need to be tactful about how we do things. And there are some things that I think we can do that are right-hearted but wrong-headed. And that's why we're having the class that we're having here, where we try to maybe consider some approaches to evangelism where we maybe are a little less confrontational. Because sometimes you get too confrontational, too in your face, the door just gets slammed and people stop listening because of how you say it and how you go about it. And that's what we're talking about a little bit here today. So, So we want to think about 3 goals of good questions. Tyler really got a good start on this. There's so much material, it's really hard to get through a lot of it, and it'll be the same way today. Really, it's just hard to get through everything we want to get through in 40 minutes time. But consider an opening verse. Let's open up our Bibles as we get started. Look at Colossians 4, verses 2 through 6. Paul says something here in Colossians 4, 2 through 6, and I'm just going to go ahead and read it to you. He says, continue steadfastly in prayer, being watchful in it with thanksgiving. At the same time, pray also for us, that God may open to us a door for the word to declare the mystery of Christ, on account of which I am in prison, that I may make it clear which is how I ought to speak. Walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of the time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. So what are some things you learn about personal evangelism from this text? You kind of just walk through it, just real quick. Pray. Now, pray before you go about it. So continue steadfastly in prayer, all right?
But also pray to God to open doors.
Pray to God for open doors. So we're praying for something specific. Pray for open doors, and maybe it'd also be smart to pray about, once the door gets opened, how am I going to wisely approach this situation? Okay, Mary Ann, you said something.
Don't talk too much.
Don't talk too much. All right. And you should have got that from last week's lesson with Tyler. Don't talk too much. Do some listening. And we're going to focus on that a little bit here today as well. Okay. Make the word manifest, though. At some point, you do have to talk. But it's good to listen and find out where somebody is and what they really believe before you start doing your talking. Walk in wisdom toward those who are outside. So I think that would suggest that you can walk in such a way that's unwise toward outsiders and ruin the opportunities that you have with other people. So we need to be very careful about how we walk toward those who are outside of Christ. What else?
Increase your knowledge daily. I don't know if that had to do with last week's
Okay.
message or not, but
Okay, we're going to have to increase our knowledge daily. From the text, part of, I think, walking in wisdom would mean we've got to have knowledge to share that wisdom with other people. Sure.
Be gracious.
Be gracious. Let your speech always be gracious. When you say you can wave at me in hell to the bull staff, does that sound like letting your speech be gracious and seasoned with salt? Perhaps that's not the best way to approach the situation on a worldwide platform that you have. So, could be a little more careful, I would probably suggest to Jaden. Redeem the time. Redeem the time. With some people, we're going to kind of mention this, but with some people, you may only have a minute of time. You may only have 20 seconds of time with them. With some people, you may sit and have a long 2-hour conversation. Who knows? You may have the opportunity week after week to keep having a conversation. But whatever time you have, make the best use of it. And that's why today we're going to look at 3 questions that I think are very powerful as we try to talk to people about the gospel. Because you may only have 10 seconds, so it's really important to have in your mind 3 ways that you can go about asking a question when you maybe have to think on your feet. You've only got 10 seconds to have these in your hip pocket and learn how to ask them in a way that it invites future opportunities for conversation. So in our last class, we talked about the importance of asking questions. So what are some jobs? What would be some jobs or occupations where asking questions is of vital importance? Teaching. You're a school teacher, you need to ask a lot of questions. You know, when I was student teaching, I remember my high school teacher saying this to me, because I'd go in there and I'd have a 45-minute lecture, and it was powerful. And I wore myself out every day with this 45-minute lecture. And I realized when you teach the same class 4 times in a row and you're lecturing for 45, you will get tired trying to prepare that. She said, you need to learn how to ask questions. And I thought it was kind of rude because I thought my lectures were really good. But I understand where she's coming from now. You need to learn how to ask the right questions. Get them to give you the information. Don't always try to instill it yourself. Force them to search and research. So you're good. Teacher. Yeah, what else?
doctor.
What's that?
A doctor.
A doctor. Doctor has to ask questions. A good doctor, they don't just come in there assuming. They want to know how you feel. Where do you hurt? What's going on? And good doctors listen to you and take the time to listen to you. That's good bedside manners, right? To try to figure out so they can properly diagnose what's going on. Good. A parent needs to ask some questions. Don't always assume. I mean, you hear noises upstairs, but I wasn't there, so I'm probably have to ask a few questions, see what was going on up there, right? You ask some questions before you assume you know what happened. Good. Somebody else over here said something. Lawyers have to ask. Yeah, and there's a line of questioning usually to get to where they're headed. So good. Lawyers have to logically ask questions. Good.
The law enforcement, they really do have to know leading, what they call leading questions, which is basically what we're talking about.
Absolutely.
Leading.
Detectives, law enforcement. Good. Which brings us to this next question. We want to think about why we ask questions. So like a good detective, there are important questions that we need to ask as we open doors of evangelism opportunity with other people. So you've got to ask the right questions for the right reasons. And I'm not going to let you answer this question because it's just an opinion question, and we're going to get to it anyway. Okay? But there's goals. There needs to be goals behind good questions. So I want to start with this. Okay? Anybody ever watch this guy? Yeah. Apparently, TJ's watched them. Okay, yeah. So Columbo is that old TV show. It's about a detective who seemed real clumsy and he seemed real befuddled, but he was a master at asking the right questions. He asked a ton of questions. He'd take a look around all the details of the case, he would scratch his head, and then he would say, no, just one more thing. And then that'd be the question that would really crack open the case, because he nailed it with that question. So he'd rattle off a great question. So when we talk with others, we've got to see ourselves as kind of modern day Columbos in a sense. We've got to get good at asking the right questions. And this takes, I think, some training, some skill, study, but we got to ask the right questions. We have to listen and then ask those questions. So the first reason that we ask questions is to gather information. Okay, so you're Columbo and you're just showing up on the scene and you're trying to figure out what's going on here. Well, you just walked in. You don't know maybe what's happened or who's involved or anything. So the first thing you got to do if you're a good detective is you just got to just ask a whole bunch of questions. You know, who's involved, what happened, where is it, how long ago did this happen, what would be some motives, just all kinds of questions. And we've got to do that to gather information before we can say, well, here's what I think happened based on the evidence. Here's my conclusion. So when you get into conversations where there's spiritual and moral and religious topics that are brought up, a key question is the question, what do you mean by that? Okay? What do you mean by that? So if you're going to have, these are just hip pocket questions, keep them in your wallet, put them in your purse somewhere, memorize them. But when you get into religious discussions, before just assuming and jumping and making your arguments, somebody says something, you don't agree with it, you think it's wrong, you know it's wrong maybe, you need to learn to ask the question, what do you mean by that? So here's a few examples of statements, and I'm going to do a little more lecture because I want to get through to the end because there's a lot of information I want to share. But all right, so somebody says, I don't believe in God because I believe in science and I believe in evolution. Well, maybe a good question would be, a couple of good questions. Well, what do you mean by God? Because people have different concepts of God. So what do you mean by God? And maybe if what you mean by God is what some other people mean by God, maybe I agree with you when it comes to the type of God you don't believe in. So what do you mean by God? What do you mean by evolution? What do you mean by evolution? I think that's a very important question to ask. I think one of the worst things you can do is say, well, I don't believe in evolution. What kind of evolution do you believe in? And how exactly would your view of evolution work? Because there's a couple different kinds of evolution. There's macroevolution, which I'm not going to try to turn this into an evolution class, but means that whales turn into horses and horses turn into people, and where you have one kind turning into different kinds. But then there's also just microevolution, which is just there's variations within kinds. I believe in microevolution. I believe that you can breed different dogs and you can come up with a different dog because you mix the breed. And you can breed them to where they got long backs and short legs and long legs. And so I believe in that sort of adaptation. I don't believe in macroevolution. So you got to ask people, what do you mean by that? I don't even think some people realize that there's maybe a difference or a distinction between those two types of evolution. So you can ask that question, figure out where somebody's at, see how much knowledge they have on that question. What do you mean by evolution? If there is, here's another one that's on your list. If there is a God, how do you explain all the evil in the world? Well, what do you mean by evil? What do you mean by evil? And then follow that with, if there is no God, then what makes bad things bad? How is it you go about defining evil? And so what do you mean by that? And that buys you time. It forces them to consider, here's what I mean by it. And then it allows you to follow up to, well, how do you determine evil? All we're starting with, though, is kind of the initial question to put the ball back in their court so you can gather some more information. All right. Another quote. I don't think we should take the Bible literally. I don't think we should. Have you ever heard somebody say that? I don't think we should take the Bible literally. Well, what specifically were you thinking of? Right? What specifically were you thinking of when you don't think we should take the Bible literally? What exactly do you mean by literally? Okay, what do you mean by that? Because I think if we were to have a conversation about that, when somebody makes that statement, people would come to find that I don't think everything in the Bible is literal either. I think all of it is inspired, but there is figurative language in the Bible. There is apocalyptic language in the Bible, like Revelation, that is meant to be taken symbolically, not absolutely literally. I don't believe there was literal frogs in Revelation, whatever chapter that was, where there were frogs there. I think that's just a picture of God's curse on people. I don't think there was a great dragon that was chained to something, a literal dragon in Revelation. I think that's symbolizing something. It's a picture for us to see. So you ask that question, what do you mean by literal? And it gives you the opportunity to say, there are some things where we'll be on the same page. But then on the other hand, do you think anything in the Bible is literal? Do you think any of those cities, aren't some of those cities real cities that we can go visit? Aren't those oceans real oceans that we can still sail across today? I mean, so the question isn't that none of the Bible is literal. The issue that perhaps you have is that some people have taken things literally that you don't think are literal. And maybe we agree there. And maybe we can go from there and think a little bit more about what it says. And then the fourth one here, everything is relative. You have your views and I have mine. That's a nice way of what people say, you do you have your truth, I have my truth. They believe in relative truth. So, question, what do you mean by relative? What do you mean by that? Is everything relative? In fact, this statement that you just made, that everything is relative, is that relative? Right? Or do you literally, absolutely mean that? Because if you do absolutely mean that, then you believe in some sort of absolute truth, right? But if you just ask those questions, what do you mean by, pick out the key word that's maybe the point of controversy, and then you're going to find out a little bit more about what this person believes. What do you mean by it? I think that's an important question for us as we gather information. Now, why is gathering information an important first step in a productive discussion? Why is this a good way to start?
You find out where they are.
Okay, you find out where they are.
God and spiritual things. They may be totally away from it, or they may have some beliefs in God and His Word.
Because if they don't tell you, and you jump into an argument, what are you doing with their beliefs? You're assuming. And how do people feel when you've assumed what they believe? They get mad at you. You're misrepresenting me. Well, this gives me the opportunity to ask you some questions so that I can listen to what you're saying and so that I can properly represent what you believe when we do start having some genuine conversation about it. And that way I don't jump to conclusions. I don't speculate. I don't assume. So we ask questions. So that allows them to not be misunderstood. And people appreciate that. People appreciate it when you ask them, tell me what you mean by that. Maybe sometimes they don't. There are going to be people who don't want to get asked any questions about it. They're just going to shut the door. But someone who's interested in genuine, honest, civil conversation will appreciate the fact that you cared enough to ask me what I believed and give me the opportunity to explain it so we could talk about it. So it allows them to be understood. It keeps me from misrepresenting their view. And then once they've told me their view, I can just restate it. So this is what I'm hearing from you, that this is what you believe. And so this is perhaps, the point of contention that we need to discuss. so I can restate what they said rather than assuming. But it also helps the individual become more clear about their own view. Has anybody ever asked you what you believe, put the ball back in your court, and it forced you to really think through what you believe because you never had really had to put it into words and be challenged about it? And so sometimes it helps them because perhaps the statement that they've made, they've never had to back it up. Nobody's ever asked them to explain it. So now they have to think through it. And they're going to be better off for it because they're going to think through it a little bit. Sometimes we're just parroting what we've heard. And this can be true in the church too. Sometimes we're just, you hear, why do you think you have to be baptized? Well, just because my church teaches you have to be baptized. You're going to have to come up with something better than that if you're talking to somebody. And it's good for you to sometimes be challenged about that so you can open up your Bible and find the reasons why it is important for us to be baptized to be saved. So you can learn to connect those supporting scriptures with the conclusion you've come to, but actually have the evidence to support it. That's key. And it's key for the people that we talk to as well. So you're going to be amazed at how often, though, people who seem confident and certain can become very shaken and uncertain with just a few simple questions. What do you mean by that? It forces them to think through it. Because I'm going to tell you, this is true not just in spiritual things, but politically. There's so many people that believe things politically and say things politically, and they don't know how to back it up or defend it or provide evidence for it. And so this helps have productive, logical conversations. Okay? All right. So one of our jobs as Christians is to cast down arguments. That's what 2 Corinthians 10 and verse 4 says. Our job is we're not fighting literal wars. We're fighting spiritual warfare. And part of that process is we're taking arguments and we're trying to cast them down. Good arguments, biblical, spiritual arguments, good arguments are supported by real facts. And a bad argument is often composed of conclusions without good facts. So the Sadducees, for example, had conclusions about the resurrection. What was their conclusion about the resurrection? There was not a resurrection. We don't believe in the resurrection, okay? And one of their arguments that they made to try to support that was a hypothetical argument. Well, what if somebody's been married and then that person died and then they got remarried and then that person died and they got remarried? And so they give this hypothetical argument. Well, who are they going to be married to in heaven? What did Jesus say to them about this conclusion that they made that was built not on evidence, but on a hypothetical situation?
They neither married or given in marriage for their lifetime.
Okay, so on that argument, right, he says, you're misunderstanding heaven. You're making an assumption about heaven that's not true, and that assumption is fueling this misconception you have about the resurrection. So good. But Matthew 22 and verse 29, Jesus answered them, "You are wrong." So every once in a while, you just kind of got to throw it out there. You're wrong because you don't know the scriptures, you're not rightly dividing the scriptures, and you don't understand the power of God. You don't seem to understand that God is powerful enough that he could raise us from the dead. It's very similar to what Paul said to the Sadducees when in Acts. He said, why does it seem so incomprehensible to you that God could raise the dead? He's God. He can do anything. So you must not believe in the power of God. So there's two things that he points out here. I want to think about opinions, and I want to think about arguments. An opinion is a point of view. Okay, that's an opinion. You have a point of view. An argument, by contrast, is a point of view that is supported by reasons. Okay, what we believe about spiritual things is not supposed to be based on opinions. Just you have a random point of view. We need to be arguing with real reasons, supporting reasons to make our argument. So it goes beyond opinion to fact. So, question 7 here then, as we get to kind of the second purpose of a good question. Okay, question number 1, what do you mean by that? is an information gathering question. When I ask that question, what do you mean by, pick the word, pick the concept, I'm just trying to gather information. But the second thing we do with good questions is we try to reverse the burden of proof. And one way that we do so is by asking this key question, all right? So, and you can phrase this in different ways, but the key question is this: how did you come to that conclusion? How did you come to that conclusion? A harsher question, if you want to be a little more blunt about it, where did you get your facts? Right? But that's a little more blunt. So, how did you come to that conclusion is a little more polite. So you're in a college classroom. None of our college kids are in here right now, but you're in a college classroom, and tell me if you've heard this story. There's a professor, he gets up in front of everybody, and he says, how many of you are Christians? Raise your hand. People raise their hand. He says, well, by the end of this class, none of you are going to claim to be Christians, because the Bible is just a bunch of myths and fairy tales. Well, that puts you on your heels a little bit, right? Not only that, you're in a college classroom, and you're talking to the professor, the guy that's going to grade your papers, right? And you're in front of a whole bunch of other students. So how do you go about this situation? Well, maybe just one simple thing is, Professor, how did you come to that conclusion that the Bible is a bunch of myths and fairy tales? And then the next perhaps question is, you're being polite, because I would definitely encourage you to be polite to your professor, and not try to necessarily humiliate him. But so are you saying that there is nothing in the Bible that is historically true or accurate at all? And at least allow him the opportunity to be honest enough to say, well, yeah, there are a few things that are true. There are some real people and some real places and some real events. Really, what you prove when you say all of it is false is you are intellectually dishonest. But instead of you being put on your heels, reverse the burden of proof and say, how did you come to that conclusion? Tell me why you think it's full of misinterpretation. I'm just really interested in what you have to say. And then kind of butter them up by saying that, right? But when you do that, you're not the one that has to explain, well, here's why I think it's not full of myths and fairy tales. I remember that sermon that guy, my preacher, preached, that one time 4 years ago, and I'm going to try to piece all of it together for you right here in front of everybody. That's probably not going to work, is it? You're not going to remember all the arguments. You're going to be nervous. You're going to mess up. He's going to find some flaw in your thinking. Just switch the question back to him. How did you come to that conclusion? Can you explain to me why you think that? Where did you get your facts? The purpose of that question is to force the arguer to prove his conclusion and responsibly give supporting evidence, because what he stated is an opinion. He stated an assumption, but he hasn't proved it. And so ask him to prove it. Christians need to be able to give supporting evidence for what they believe. If you look at 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15. Peter writes to these people, sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you with meekness and fear. Now, I don't think you have to be ready for every single argument that ever comes your way. What is the reason for our hope when you read 1 Peter 3:15? Or the context? What is this central supporting evidence for why we have a hope? The resurrection, yeah. Why is that important to the people that Peter's writing to? What are they going through? What is Peter all about? Suffering. Trials. Some of them are dying for their faith. And so there's people who are saying, why, when you Christians are suffering and under trials and losing your jobs, dying for your faith, why do you still hold on to your integrity? Why don't you just give it up? And so when you get asked that question, Peter says you need to be ready to give a reason for the hope that is in you. And the reason for your hope is I believe in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. I believe people saw him dead. People saw him at the empty tomb. People saw him alive. He lives again. And because of that, I believe in Jesus Christ, that he's the Son of God. And I'm willing to die for my faith and for my belief. So you need to have a reason. So that reason, that fact, that piece of evidence supports the conclusion that you've come to, that I believe in Jesus and I'm willing to suffer for him because I believe in him that strongly.
There were writers in the first and second century that wrote about, they were not members of the church, but just, Josephus or other people that confirmed that there was a man named Jesus that lived. And, it's not just religious people, but people outside.
Sure. Yeah. And these are handy arguments to have when we actually get people to engage us in an honest conversation about, for example, that. Why do you believe in Jesus? Why do you believe he's the Son of God? Why do you believe he was even real? A real historical character. So those types of facts will be helpful as we get people to move beyond the questioning stage and actually talk. But Christians need to be able to give supporting reasons. We know that as Christians, but unbelievers also need to be able to give supporting reasons for why they believe what they do. And a lot of people can't. They just parrot what they've heard our culture saying, what they've heard in schools and secular on TV and from their favorite political pundits, and they can't really give you good, solid evidence. So this is what this question does. How did you come to that conclusion? So to use another, old movie, you got Ricky Ricardo always saying to Lucy, you got some splaining to do. Right? So that's what we're doing. We've got Columbo gathering information, and the second tactic is asking people to reverse the burden of proof. You need to explain to me why you believe that. You made an assumption, but you got to tell me why you believe it, so we can get somewhere. All right. 1 Peter, we already quoted that. 1 Peter 3:15. By the way, let's just back that up. Give a defense, yet do it with gentleness and respect. Going back to the Jaden Ivey example, let's do it with gentleness and respect, because you can really lose your audience when you lack gentleness and respect for the other person that you're talking to. All right, this is from Gregory Kukul. I wanted to mention this book because I don't have time to get into everything that he gets into in the book. This is what Tyler was using some last week. He's read this. I've read this. That's why I asked Tyler to teach that class, because I know he's read that. And this particular book is a fantastic approach if you want help in how to talk to my friends, my coworkers, my neighbors. Here, so many of you, I know that if you're working, you're in situations where maybe you've got clauses where you can't, it's very difficult to proselytize without getting in trouble. But when you ask people questions, you haven't preached anything. You're asking them questions. You're asking them to tell you what they believe. So that you can perhaps have a conversation without necessarily stating your position. So it's a non-confrontational approach to evangelism, to open the door to a conversation, but to not necessarily be in your face about it. So he says this: I frequently get calls from people who think they are giving me an argument when all they are doing is forcefully stating a view. And this move may sound compelling at first. Their story might even seem plausible, but there is a difference between giving an explanation and giving evidence why the explanation is a good one. So, 3 further questions, all right? When you try to reverse the burden of proof. Going through this quickly again, but 3 important questions that you might ask. Number 1, is it possible, okay, the argument that's being made, is it possible? Is it plausible? And is it probable? Okay, I'm gonna give you 3 topics to think about as you ask those 3 questions and reverse the burden of proof. Number 1, we can't trust the Bible. You hear this on TV, if you watch the History Channel, Discovery Channel, a lot of the documentaries, you listen to a lot of secular people. This gets parroted over and over again. We can't trust the Bible. The original scriptures were altered by sexist men in the 3rd and 4th centuries. The Bible's been altered many times through the years. Well, a question. reverse the burden of proof when that statement gets made. Instead of you trying to pull out all kinds of evidence about why you can trust the Bible and all the manuscript evidence and all. Well, how does that work? How does that work? You just made an argument that all the manuscripts have been altered by sexist men in the 3rd and 4th centuries. So how does that work? Is it really possible? There's your question. Is it really possible that men altered and edited every manuscript and ancient text so it would suit their sexism? Is that possible? That we've dug up thousands of texts all over Western civilization, and men have altered every single one of them to suit their sexist beliefs. There are thousands of manuscripts, so is that really even possible? Okay, there's a question. I think it's a question that people might have to answer, okay? Is that clock not working?
No.
Okay. I thought I had a lot of time left. And that's because the minute hand's not moving, and I just caught on to that. So, okay. We might pick up from there in our next class, because I want to pick up a couple more of these questions, keep working through it, but I want to take time on this. But thank you for your attention.